Hello and welcome to the next of our lecture recaps. This is a recap of our lecture on corporate social responsibility. So what is corporate social responsibility? Well, remember that we are a corporate legal entity. So in legal terms, the corporation is another person. Therefore, you have responsibility to others. Well, the question here is, do we have that responsibility to others, or are we only interested in shareholder wealth? So the first area that we looked at was Carroll's model of corporate social responsibility, and it looks at four main areas of corporate social responsibility, ranging from, first of all, the economic. So that's looking simply at the return to shareholders, the treatment of employees, the quality that you give to customers, and you must achieve these areas first. So it sort of ranges up the way from the economic through the other three areas. So the economic is solely focusing on making money. The legal aspect is the next area, i.e. you should act within the law. So no price fixing, no collusion, those sorts of things, acting within the law. Once you've done that, you can then think about ethical areas. So that's what's expected by society, and that's over and above the simple legal requirements. Once you've considered the ethical requirements, well then you can go on to philanthropic. So philanthropic is really thinking about things like charitable donations and sponsorship. So there are four main areas that Carroll determined: economic, legal, ethical and philanthropic, and it goes through those four from economic up to philanthropic. Carroll also talked about the response to social pressure by the entity. So how does the entity respond to social pressure? So there are various things the corporation could do. They could first of all reaction, and that would be to deny responsibility. They could undertake a defence, which is to do the least possible that they can get away with. Or they can undertake accommodation, and that is to respond and act accordingly. The last is proaction, and proaction is to go beyond the requirements. So those are various responses that we needed to be aware of that the corporation could take to those corporate social responsibility requirements. We also brought in the area of stakeholders here. First of all, looking at shareholders. So what level of responsibility do shareholders have for corporate social responsibility? Remember, shareholders do have various rights. They have the rights to sell their shares. They have the rights to vote. They should be given all of the information. And of course, they can sue the directors potentially if they don't do something correctly. However, they are not responsible for the company's actions. Management are responsible for the company's actions. So shareholders may well be affected by management decisions just like other stakeholders. So what about those other stakeholders? Well, remember we talked about the power analysis that we need to undertake for our stakeholders. We need to identify our key stakeholders. We need to establish their interests and their claims. We need to determine their ability to influence the business and identify any potential conflict that we might have with them. We can then attempt to minimise that conflict. So there are various classifications of shareholders that we could have. For example, narrow and wide stakeholders. Narrow stakeholders being those very close to the business. Wide being taking a wider view of society. Primary and secondary stakeholders is very similar to that. And we have also active and passive stakeholders, those stakeholders that actively pursue and discuss things with the business, and those passive stakeholders who still have an interest but aren't that bothered. We also have voluntary and involuntary stakeholders. Some stakeholders will want to be involved with the business, some have no choice. So Mendelow said that we can classify our stakeholders based on their power and their interest. So on the left hand side we have the power ranging from high powered stakeholders to low power. We also have level of interest from low level of interest to high level of interest. So if we have stakeholders with high power but a low level of interest, well, we simply need to keep them satisfied. If the stakeholders have high power and are highly interested, well then those are the key players that we need to deal with regularly. If they have low power and a low level of interest, well then we just have minimal effort. We don't need to really worry about those stakeholders too much. If they have low power and a high level of interest, well, we need to keep them informed, but we're not too worried because they have that low level of power. So how do we deal with the relationship with these stakeholders once we understand them? Well, we'll assess their importance through that stakeholder matrix, looking at their power, the legitimacy of that power, and the urgency of any issues that they have. And then if there are any conflicts, we'll need to resolve them. So we can do that by satisficing, coming to a compromise with the stakeholders, sequential action, taking turns to look at the issues, making side payments to appease the stakeholders, or indeed a simple exercise of power to say, well, no, we're not doing that. So what we might do here is think, well, why do we need to bother about these stakeholders? Well, the instrumental view would say that our stakeholders could affect the objectives of the organisation. So that would damage the company and what it wants to do. It's not really thinking about a moral obligation, it's just thinking the stakeholders could prevent us doing what we want to do. A normative view would say, well, we have a moral duty to keep these stakeholders involved for social cohesion, so we therefore should think about and consider those stakeholders. The last thing that we talked about was our corporate citizenship. So CC stands for corporate citizenship. So that's going beyond stakeholders and thinking about the impact that the business has on society as a whole. So that impact may be through our competition and the abuse of our market power perhaps, or the abuse of our employees in low wage economies, and indeed self-regulation where maybe we don't implement the regulation rigorously enough. So we'll go on to talk about ethics and how ethics will lead us to be a good corporate citizen later on in this module. So that was a recap of our lecture on corporate social responsibility.